Hello. Thank you for joining us for today's Insightful Leader Live webinar. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight. Today, we will be talking about artificial intelligence with Kellogg Professor Brian Uzzi and Elemental Cognition's Dave Ferrucci. It is hard to imagine a hotter discussion topic at the moment, but before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. We will be closing the chat box soon, so if you want to get in your answer about how much time you've spent on ChatGPT, go ahead and do that now. Please leave your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. You can also upvote each other's questions. Closed captioning is available. Access it via live transcript at the bottom of the screen. And this event is being recorded. Everyone who registered for today's webinar will get a link to a video of this presentation in their inbox. All right. So the latest artificial intelligence models, including language models like ChatGPT, have the world riveted. Earlier this week, a New York Times reporter put ChatGPT to the test as an assistant and found it did a pretty darn good job developing a travel itinerary. Others have been impressed by its ability to write simple business plans or grant proposals or marketing copy. This is some pretty wild stuff. Many people think this technology is on the verge of disrupting a lot of knowledge work. But these models are not perfect, and neither are the societies that we've built to house them. So there is also a lot of concern about how the deployment of these models will change a lot of things, perhaps in ways we don't yet understand. This week, we even saw a petition signed by some scientists and industry leaders calling for a temporary halt on the training of these models. So let's get talking. We will have two speakers today. We will be speaking with Dave Ferrucci. Ferrucci is founder, CEO, and chief scientist at Elemental Cognition, which builds hybrid AI. He's led AI research teams at Bridgewater Associates and IBM Research, where most famously, he led the Watson project that first beat Jeopardy. He's also an adjunct professor of management and organizations at Kellogg. And Ferrucci will be joined by Brian Uzzi, a professor of management and organizations at Kellogg. He studies big data and network science and is co-director of the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems. So today's conversation is going to be an absolute treat. I want to welcome Dave Ferrucci and Brian Uzzi.
Thank you, Jessica. Hey, Dave.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's launch in. I want to go ahead and start with kind of a basic question. I know from our responses, it seems like the majority of this audience does have some experience with this. But if you don't mind just kind of stepping back a little bit, what are these models and what are the things that they are already capable of?
Great. So did you want me to address that first? I can take
Absolutely.
a crack at that. Yeah, I mean, I think, it sounds like the audience has a lot of experience with them already, which is fascinating, at least using them. I think the way I kind of characterize, what they do is they're incredibly good at predicting the sort of language that humans might write because they're trained on so much massive amounts of human written content. And they build these distributions, in other words, how words tend to occur together. And then when you give it, a prompt, it quickly narrows in on very similar contexts that it has seen before and stored in these distributions, and starts to predict the next likely word. And as it continues that prediction, it includes that and then starts to predict the next likely word. But these distributions have such powerful and accurate probabilities because of how expertly they've been trained on so much data that they produce these really coherent linguistic structures that pull, if you will, from the training data. So it's extremely powerful. While they've been around for a long time, most recently, the amount of training data that they've given them is enormous, and that while expensive, creates a remarkable result. And we'll talk about all the implications of that.
Yeah, very good. Jessica, I would just add to that, not being a computer scientist like Dave and having made the advances he's made on the technical side, I'd say the way that I think about these models is they really learn the way humans learn expertise. I mean, the way in which you get better at something, you gain expert knowledge, is by doing lots and lots of interactions with the same kind of problems and similar data over and over again. So if you're a stock analyst and you want to follow the 5 FANG stocks, the more data you see over the more amount of time, the greater your expertise becomes. That's why we value expertise and why it takes so much time to get it. The issue is that learns so much faster and can learn so much more than any single human can learn, that it goes way beyond the cognitive limitations of any person. And that is what in many ways so fascinating.
Yeah, I would argue that they actually don't learn exactly the same way humans do. I think you're absolutely right, Brian, that the massive amount of data and the compute scale allows them to consider so much more information. But there's 2 different ways humans learn. And I think one way is very aligned with how these models learn. Another one, not as much. So one way we learn is we look at patterns. We look at syntactic or structural patterns. So you can imagine someone reading a text and then they get a question and they look at that question and they syntactically look back at the text and say, where does it match best? And and can I now generate the answer based on how the words seem to occur in the text without necessarily interpreting any of the text? So they're not building internal mental or logical model of what's going on. They're just basically predicting what the most likely word would be through that pattern matching. That pattern matching is a very powerful way of learning, but it doesn't require interpretation into a logical model. And the other way we learn is we learn how to build structures in our brains about how things actually work. And those models are not about how things occur syntactically, but more about how they interact dynamically and structurally. And that's another way we learn, where now we can reason over that. So these models are not doing that. But the interesting thing about them is there's so much language out there that a lot of the way we think is projected by the language we use. So when you project, if you could process enough language, when you project out of that language starts to mimic the way we think. And so it's really interesting to think about those 2 ways of what's going on, because we have to understand what the powers and limitations of this technology is based on how it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting, Deb. I totally agree with you. And I think it's a great way to look at this because, you talked earlier, Jess, about, some of the ways in which this could change society and the human race. I mean, when you think about learning, if every day the sun comes up and goes down, you don't need reasoning to be able to predict that the next day it's going to happen. But when there's gaps in that knowledge, that's where human reasoning has been so powerful, because it allows us to make estimations about predictions. But maybe these models, given that they can look at so many things over such a greater period of time than any of us could ever do, maybe only predictive learning, like the rising of the sun going up and down, is going to be the thing that really characterizes the human race.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. This goes back to, I think Dan Kahneman has the book Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, and it talks about the 2 different ways in which humans think. And one of them is more intuitive or predictive or statistical in nature, where we look at a few examples, and based on those examples, we make a prediction. It's also the foundation of inductive reasoning. We extrapolate from examples. So regression is that type of reasoning. It's extremely biased by the empirical data that you look at. If you look at a small amount of data, you're probably not going to do as well as you look at a large amount of data in terms of getting that prediction right. But you don't necessarily have a good reason for why, because you don't have that dynamic model, like how the things actually interact. So science is all about looking at what happens statistically and then formulating a theory so that you can predict outside of the data. And this is exactly one of those challenges that we face with statistical systems, what Kahneman called system 1 versus system 2, which is slower, but gives you sounder, more founded reasoning and results.
Well, that sounds like a good time to sort of bring this back to the language models like ChatGPT. So could you mind kind of talking a little bit about kind of how this actually manifests in what these things can do and maybe what these things can't do?
Well, if I could jump in, Dave, there was a recent study, it's yet unpublished, by the University of Pennsylvania. And basically they went into all the job data that we have collected on terms of skills and tasks within jobs across all types of jobs. And the basic approach was to say, what could AI do 50% faster than a human could do? And basically their conclusion, and I haven't seen, the ins and outs of the study, so be a little careful in interpreting it all, but basically what they find is 80% of jobs are going to have 50% or more of their job doable by AI. Basically looking at speed and scalability. So when you talk about what could come out of these models, one huge thing is really going to be about jobs. Now, one of the things that's exciting and also a little scary about this is when you look at 80% of the jobs, a lot of them are really high income jobs: accountants, attorneys, mathematicians, interpreters, chess writers as well, journalists, public relations people, court reporters, judges, presidents, and so on and so forth. And we've already seen Netanyahu use ChatGPT to write a speech. So the implications are really far-reaching in like what they would be able to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is a watershed moment. I mean, for AI and the impact it will have on society and on the economy. I think that it forces us to step back and look at the types of jobs we do, what we do with our brains, with our cognition. And one of the things that we do is we take in information and we synthesize it and summarize it from different perspectives. A lot of jobs are a lot of white collar jobs, or knowledge workers, I should say. A lot of knowledge worker jobs are doing that. They're synthesizing, they're reading, they're synthesizing, summarizing, coming in with a particular perspective and making an argument or tailoring the content to that perspective. And that's a lot of what knowledge workers do. And this technology is good at that. I mean, it's very good at that. It doesn't really have to interpret or understand, because ultimately, if it does a good job at projecting the right language, the human consumer is going to be satisfied with the result. And that's sort of what matters. So I think that this is a real thing. This is something these jobs will be accelerated for sure. I think that these jobs will, people will be in some sense required to at least try these things and see if they can help them do better jobs. I think it raises a lot of questions at the same time around transparency, veracity, bias, and accountability.
Yeah. The other thing that comes to my mind, that listening to you speak, Dave, is, and I didn't realize this until you started talking, is so much of this UPenn study is about all the jobs that are going to, essentially get smaller and be retracted. There was very little talk in the paper, from what I gathered so far, as to what's going to be the new jobs. What will come out of this that may also lead to some creation. In what I read, they're basically saying auto mechanics and cooks are pretty safe in their jobs, which doesn't sound like enough of a countervailing force. I would imagine there'll probably be a lot of jobs of just people being caretakers for machines.
Well, I think there's two things. I think I see a question around teaching, actually, which is another interesting impact that this can have, because I think it can be trained to help have a pedagogical or educational dialogues with students, which is very interesting as well. But the point I wanted to make about the point you made about the electricians, or I don't know what you mentioned, but And what were the two jobs?
Auto mechanics and cooks.
Oh, auto mechanics cooks. Yeah, I think that what we're sort of forgetting a little bit is that what is the underlying technology of these large language models?
Mm-hmm.
And this is really these deep learning, these transformer devices, if you will, that learn, that are very capable of using examples to predict the next step to do. That are getting applied to language, but they can get applied to other kinds of patterns, not just linguistic patterns. So the effect these models might have on more precise and effective robotics shouldn't be, underestimated.
Mm-hmm.
So we might see advances in other areas of AI, not just linguistic AI, that also has this impact. So I think this is why you're getting this huge sort of response to, and people kind of all over the world scratching their head and saying, what does this really mean? What does it mean for intelligence, for human cognition, for economy, for work? I think these are big questions that we all have to face. I do think jobs will be created. And I think those jobs that will be created will be jobs will be transformed, and part of that transformation will be jobs being created. And I think that will be centered around how humans effectively collaborate with this. This is another form of intelligence. How do humans effectively collaborate with this other form of intelligence? How do we make the collaboration between this sort of intelligence and human intelligence ultimately complementary and effective, and something we want? So I think there'll be a lot to do around exploring that. But imagining that you're working in it's getting harder and harder to imagine that we will be working in isolation or from artificial intelligence. We will be working with artificial intelligence in one form or another.
Now,
I'm sorry, Jess.
you can go ahead. I got a question, a follow-up after you.
That because, I think Dave is absolutely right. This kind of collaborative approach is very powerful. But one of the things that, kind of gets under my skin and that I'm trying to work through right now, a lot of my career has been about studying human creativity. And many people, when they talk about kind of like the machine plus the human being partnership, well, as human beings are so creative, how wonderful. That's going to be, our sweet spot in this partnership. But as I read the study about job replacement, it really hit me that so much of the focus is on AI doing things faster and at bigger scale. Like we are obsessed with just being able to do more faster and speeding up our lives. But there is a whole body of research in human creativity that says speeding up your life eats away at your creativity. Emily Bronte, for instance, and her sisters, they used to purposefully knit in the evenings because having that downtime and doing something with your hands rather than being more focused cognitively was the essence of the sorts of things that gave them creativity. Children learn creativity by playing with, Lego pieces. And maybe we don't realize it, but in an effort to speed up our world, to do more with the machines, to give the machines more latitude and collaborations, to, accelerate more and more things we do, we might actually be putting ourselves on a path that ruins our best competitive advantage, which is, in fact, creativity.
When you say competitive advantage, what do you mean? Competitive with the AI or competitive with each other, or what do you mean?
Competitive advantage with AI. I think every collaboration is about two great competitive advantages, being brought together.
Well, I think in the limit, the big and important role for humans to play in that collaboration is to bring meaning and value. Machines are not humans. They will never be humans. They are not sentient. They are processing massive amounts of data. They can be creative because with enough data, they can consider so many different alternatives. And ultimately, any creation is some permutation of the data that's kind of out there. And they could generate these permutations and they could check them and they could evaluate them in a number of different ways. If they have enough data, you're going to see them being what we would call creative, generating useful permutations. But they don't have, they're not connected to, they're not human. They're not connected to human values. Right? So ultimately, humans have to use AI as a tool to direct and further and to advance human society. And we have to make decisions. We have to be responsible. And this is where this goes back to my concern around who are we holding accountable? How is the machine coming up with these alternatives and these answers? Isn't transparent enough? Where is it getting its biases? How do we know what's true and what's not true? And who takes responsibility? And I think so when we collaborate with this form of intelligence, are we clear about our own role and what we need to do in guiding and using that?
Yeah, I want to make sure this is something that you brought up a little bit earlier, which is sort of the issues around veracity, transparency, bias. I was hoping you could dive into that in a little bit more detail, especially since some of these are very part and parcel with the the makeup of these models. Some of this, lack of transparency is like literally built into these models. So I think a quick primer would be really helpful.
Yeah, so I mean, again, they're trained on massive amounts of data. They're unlike search in that they're not pointing you to a document that has an author. They're in some sense extracting from all documents, re-representing all the words that are in those documents in these distributions. They put them in similar contexts and they say, what word would come next, given how these words tend to occur probabilistically with each other. So, and then they could generate based on that, but they're not picking a document and author, they're generating. So they're highly biased by their training data. I mean, if you give it lots of different documents that have a particular point of view, it's going to mimic how words are used and probabilistically follow each other in that training data. So they're very, very specifically and directly biased by their training data. They're also biased by the prompt. As many of you have used ChatGPT, you give it a prompt, and it's designed to follow the prompt, to look for things that are consistent, probabilistically consistent with the prompt. So you could prompt it to say one thing and you could prompt it to say another thing. So it's extremely biased by the prompt. Understanding that is important. And there's a question about when you're reading something, when you're given an answer from one of these machines, knowing how it was trained, what training data was used, what prompt was used. And then it's very easy for the makers of the models to also decorate or elaborate the prompt to ensure that the answers take a particular direction. So when we get an answer or result out of these things, what do you want to know about that? And so that's that's the issue of transparency. If they draw a conclusion, how did they draw that conclusion? Was it drawn based on what source material? Who were the authors of those source material? Who do we hold accountable ultimately for that, for the veracity? And more importantly, do I have the transparency to even try to determine that? And then ultimately related to that is the accountability. Who's accountable for the output? Who's responsible for the social effects? Who owns the output? Like in the case of creativity and innovation, where they generate a permutation that happens to be spectacularly useful. Who owns that in the end? So these are all really open questions. To what extent can this be, given how easy it is to bias these models? How do we control them? And I think this is largely behind the petition. people saying, can we hold for 6 months because we just don't understand the implications of the bias that can get built into these systems and how they might be used to promote propaganda and all kinds of other things. We just don't appreciate that yet.
Yeah, we got several questions about that petition. I'm curious what you guys have to say about it. What's your perspective? Or if you wanted to, you could broaden it a little bit and say, like what are the types of guardrails, whether it's this, 6-month pause, or whether it's something else that we should be putting in forward to ensure that these systems do what we want them to do.
Well, I think Dave is right on with this point. I mean, he's really outlined the problem well. Where my concerns come from is, yes, you need accountability, but who's going to set up accountability? I mean, our current systems for accountability are basically regulations. Regulations are always contested, and sometimes they're, put down just on the basis of people don't want to be regulated from anybody or anyone. And so if you're going to start to go down that path, the question is, well, how do you go about doing it? Given the current systems we have. I also think that whole problem is going to be intensified by the fact of something else that Dave said, which is you get what you want out of the machine. You can lead the witness, so to speak, by asking the right kind of questions. I will make a prediction. I think 2 years from now, there's going to be a whole consulting world and ways in which to ask questions just from ChatGPT or any other chat box, whether it's Ernie or whoever, because that is going to be a really important part of this whole ecosystem that's going to, begin to come out. And then that's just a piece of the arms race. The other piece of the arms race is going to be contested. Well, who's right and who's wrong in these chat worlds? Because it's not going to just be ChatGPT. There'll be 5, 10, 20 of them.
Yeah, there's already open sourcing of these things. Again, these pieces are very readily used and reused, and you can train them with different data, so you can have, war of the chatbots, all having a different opinion about things. So it's very interesting, and so you have this contrast between: do you try to centralize? If you try to centralize control over these things, it leads to censorship and the end of open debate. If you distribute them, you have a free-for-all, which leads to a massive war of words. So I think these are some of the challenges that we face going forward with this stuff. I think that's very true. And in fact, at Elemental Cognition, we use large language models like ChatGPT, but we don't use them, as like one shot, throw something in, answer a question. We actually build applications where you have a particular goal and you're trying to essentially do a good job in interpreting language into a knowledge structure. In other words, you're not going from words to words. You're going from words to not a foundational language model, but a foundational knowledge model that you can then share and be transparent about. This is what I think, and this is how I think, and this is how I make formal inferences. So to your point, a lot of the work we do in using large language models is crafting the prompts to get them to do what we need them to do to produce accurate interpretations. This is like a dark art right now. And of course, we're trying to turn it into a science where we devise ways in which we could count on consistent interpretations of the language into a formal knowledge model. Because you want the fluency, you want the linguistic fluency that these things like ChatGPT give you, but then you want the precision of the interpretation and the reasoning you do on the knowledge model. So what you're saying, Brian, is exactly right. There's a whole, talking about generating more jobs. How do you control these things to do what you want them to do? The flip side of that is you can control them to do what you want them to do.
Yes,
that's exactly what we get. Now, so what do you want them to do? What is your intent? So it's very, very interesting. I think that's really important for people to understand. And that's why, we're looking at, or are you going to have regulation? How do you control this? How do you manage this? Where do we want to be on this spectrum? And it's really a fascinating question. I don't have the answers. If you ask me, do I want to sign the petition? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's inevitable that the human race is going to learn how to collaborate with this form of intelligence. It's inevitable. It's just a matter of time. And the idea of slowing it down doesn't make a lot of sense to me. On the other hand, giving us a chance to take a breather and think about the implications is probably wise. This petition may ultimately be largely symbolic, and getting people to wake up and say, this is something serious going on. We need to think about its implications. And I think that's right on.
Yeah, Jess, I would just pipe, say the same thing here, that I think Dave is right. We need a pause. It may be just symbolic, but maybe that's enough to get people to start thinking a little more deeply about what's going on. And I say that because I remember 15 years ago when social media started, there was a similar petition among scientists that we didn't know what was going to happen. Yes, it looks like this biblical gift from God, all this knowledge, all this open exchange. We're going to meet people from different cultures. We're going to learn to accept them. We'll have assimilation. We'll have, more creativity, put in desperate ideas together. And then it became monetized. And once it became monetized, then, it had a completely different trajectory. And it turned into a world of, incivility, disinformation, and we still can't decide what kind of regulation we want for that. And that's just a tiny thing compared to AI.
Yeah, I think there are I think, Brian, you're dead on in the sense that there are a lot of interesting parallels between, social media and this. You're giving a huge amount, even digital media, you're able to amplify things so dramatically and so quickly. And that has huge, impact. And because it has huge impact, it has both big economic incentives and big political incentives. So how this is going to be monetized, how it's going to be controlled, because it can drown out potentially all other voices in some sense. So this is another really interesting question for us as a society, because it is kind of it could be used as a weapon of massive scale, because it could generate so much content. And it's language content. And one of the interesting things, and I've been thinking about this a lot, we think about human cognition and human cognitive biases and human cognitive weaknesses. I believe anyway that our logical brain is very tightly tied to our linguistic brain. So we conflate these things together. We find things credible when they sound good. This is why rhetoric is such a powerful thing. Why language can be used to persuade people so effectively. And we're attracted to that. We're affected by that. We're brought in by that. Good language, coherent sounding content is credible, independently of provenance and veracity. So we have to understand that, because now we could flood the channels with this stuff. So it goes back to who controls it. It goes back to transparency. How do I, where's this coming from? What. So anyway, these are the sorts of things that I think that we face. So on one hand, AI and our ability to use it to advance society, is, I think, inevitable. It's not practical to think about stopping it, but we do have to understand how to relate to it and how to use it effectively and how to figure out how do we want to think about that and control that. So those are very, very interesting, tough questions, I think, for society as a whole to face.
Yeah, you know, it's like a knot. It's so hard to untie. You know, I don't know how many people out there know about Brandolini's law. Familiar with Brandolini's law? Basically, it says, well, it's got a simple name. It's called the bullshit asymmetry principle. And it basically says that it takes a tiny fraction of the time to come up with good sounding lies than it does to actually communicate the truth. And it's so much easier to write something offensive to someone than to think about writing something that's going to open their mind to a different point of view. And the machines can really take advantage of Brandolini's law.
No, that's right. And then again, that goes back to how do we train them? Who's accountable for what they're doing and how they're working? Anyway, a lot of tough questions, a lot of balancing to do, right? Because you want open debate, you want transparency, but there are going to be other forces that pull in the other direction. So how do you deal with that? I mean, I think those are going to be really interesting questions.
I want to get here to a question that we got from the audience on education. This kind of some of what you were saying a little earlier, Dave, about sort of the cognitive implications of interacting with these machines. I think of a concept from cognitive psychology called ease of processing, which is this idea that if things seem easy to understand, we think we understand them even when we don't. It's kind of an educational concept. It's kind of like if something gets so good at communicating information exactly at our level, personally tailored to us, we don't actually slow down and realize the parts that we don't understand. And so getting to this broader question about the impact of education, young minds need practice in thinking, in wrestling with ideas, in maybe getting information from a source that is a little less coherent, a little less perfectly tailored to us, so that we do the work of actually understanding something. Is this something that you've thought about? How do you see this technology maybe changing how we educate?
Great point. I'd love to hear what Brian has to say about this as well. But this is a very passionate area for me. I'm a big proponent on educating people to learn how to think critically, critical thinking. That is not about a particular point of view, but it's how to analyze a point of view. It's not about a particular answer, but it's how to convince yourself that that answer actually makes sense. It's how to separate the rhetoric and the persuasive style of language from the logic and the meaning behind the language. We are, without training, we are extremely susceptible to that. I remember taking an executive presentation class, and I was shocked to hear the teacher tell me 85% of what the audience is left with is visual and has nothing to do with what you actually say. Not just visual, but in other words, things that are on the surface. The sound of your voice, the rhythm, how you stand, how you look and engage with the audience. That these things will have more of an impression, the actual logical content of what you communicate. So the sound of the language, the style of the language, the cognitive burden, as you're saying, do I know my audience well enough to tailor it so that it's easy for them to consume it? As Brian was saying, it doesn't offend them. It doesn't send them emotionally off in one direction or shut them down, but rather opens them up. And now are they more susceptible to whatever the idea is? This is very, very significant. And these machines are very powerful. These models can choose words that are more consistent with a particular point of view. Another thing that opens our mind is if someone's saying something that we already have a prior reason to agree with, right? And then we get shut down when we think we're going to disagree. So and going back to the idea that humans are going to have to collaborate with this kind of intelligence, while the intelligence might do a lot of the grunt work for us, we're going to have to make those value judgments. And that comes from learning how to be a critical thinker, learning how to be objective, open up our minds, how to actually validate, check, understand, build rational models for what we're hearing, understanding what's an assumption and what's a logical inference. This is critical thinking. Understanding our own weaknesses. One of the things, and then I'm going to stop and I want Brian to comment on this, but I'm excited about this. One of the things we do at Elemental Cognition is we worry about the natural tendency for people to do confirmation biases. In other words, I'm going to ask a question, whether it's to a search engine or to a ChatGPT, but I'm going to assume, the thing I'm putting in. I'm going to assume my hypothesis. I'm always going to get some evidence. There's so much stuff out there. I will easily generate something that's consistent with what I said, barring a bias that the model put in intentionally. I'm going to get something. No matter what I search for, I'm going to get something that supports it. And so the question becomes, well, should I be asking for the opposite thing? Should I be ensuring that I can, I might find evidence for the refuting hypothesis? So one of the things that we do at Elemental Cognition is every time we have a hybrid AI system that, again, doesn't go language to language, it goes to language to foundational knowledge models, that, to reasoning, and then ultimately crafts language. But if you ask it something, it automatically generates the refuting hypothesis and presents, here's the supporting evidence, here's the refuting evidence. So this is an example of acknowledging the cognitive biases that we have. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Well, what Dave's talking about now, this disconfirming information, that's huge. Like, nobody's doing this. You mentioned psychology. So psychology is known for 50 years that we seek out confirming information and all the kind of problems it creates for us, but coming up with solutions has been much more difficult. And now that we live in this giant echo chamber that's in the palm of our hand day and night, confirming information has gotten even worse. Dave has got a solution for that I think is very exciting. The other comment I would make is, Dave has really started off talking about kind of like, what's the content you want people to learn and what's the rhetoric that gets them to believe it. This is actually a super old debate. It goes back 100 years, and the two people who are most associated with it are Einstein and Edison. And the public debate was over content. And Edison, being a very practical guy who came up with truly world-changing innovations, thought that all content should be based on facts. So he would interview people to come work for him. He'd say, what's the distance from, the Earth to the moon? How many cars could be on the Golden Gate Bridge without it collapsing? Like, he wanted just factual knowledge. And Einstein comes out and says, you don't want factual knowledge. People can look that up. What you want is you want to be able to teach people to think critically, which is exactly what a phrase that Dave just used. That debate has never truly been settled. And at universities, you kind of come down, well, you want to give people both, because maybe we don't know what direction we should go in. One of the ideas about large language models is, well, maybe you don't need to know facts anymore at all, because they are all at our fingertips. And really the objective is to teach people to think. But I'm not sure we know how to do that.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about saying facts versus assertions. I mean, one of the things we talk about is, ChatGPT can hallucinate, meaning it's generating from prior language. What is a fact and what is not a fact is already a question, in these sorts of things. It's one thing to look something up in a fact database. It's another thing, to generate something and assume it's a fact from statistical language. So it's a little bit tricky there. But the point about, notwithstanding the point about critical thinking, whether it's opinions, facts, inference, conclusions, how do you ultimately convince yourself that something makes sense? What assumptions are you making? What are the things that you need to be arguing and understanding more deeply? How are you drawing the conclusions? So I think as more and more information comes at us from more and more sources, we struggle with the amount of intellectual energy we have to put into that critical thinking. It's very easy to pick a side and just say, hey, if this is consistent with that side, I believe it. It's very easy to say, wow, that was convincing. That sounded really good. it's much harder to kind of do that independent thinking. And I think when we come back to education, that's going to me, that's what's going to enable the next generation to deal with the realities that they're facing now, which is you need to learn how to think critically.
Mhm. Yeah, well put. It does make you wonder whether facts, if people want any, if the world is at a place right now where they don't even want facts anymore. They just want things that are consistent with their prior beliefs.
Well, that consistent with their prior experiences, right? Again, this goes back to what Jess was saying, is that, that's less cognitive burden.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a critical issue. This is a critical issue, in my opinion.
I do want to make sure that we have a little bit of a chance to talk about what the business implications of this are going to be. Obviously, businesses exist in society, so the social implications are the business implications. But I'm curious if you have any specific advice. If you were a leader or a manager and you were trying to think about what you need to be doing in the next couple of years to prepare for what is to come, what advice do you have? Would you be thinking about reorganizing your personnel? How would you be thinking about taking advantage of this really unique moment?
Well, one thing that I think companies could really do better is, as Dave has been saying, these models get their juice on the information that's fed into them. And one of the best competitive advantages that all companies have is internal data that no one else has, that's specific to their business and important for their functioning. But that data tends not to be managed well. It tends to be, in whole different parts of the organization. It can't be combined together, but information is in fact the thing that makes the whole system go. And so organizations should pay a lot more attention to managing, curating, combining, cleaning the data they have, because that is their secret sauce relative to their competitors.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that is the data. The data is what drives these systems. What they say is based on what they train on. I think that's absolutely true. I think the other thing is a company should understand the technology, what its strengths and its weaknesses are, and look at their current processes and their current functional roles and see where can this help? Where can this make us more efficient? But at the same time, be cautious of, again, issues around transparency and accountability, bias and veracity. But given an awareness of that, where can we inject it to help the company be more efficient? I think that's certainly all companies should be thinking about that and looking at that. I also think that the technology, ChatGPT is some sense an application of a more fundamental technology. So understanding what the more fundamental technology is, this deep learning technique is something business should also be looking at. Where can this be applied to drive better products, greater efficiency? So I think that companies who don't start understanding this and start innovating around it will fall behind. So I think that's kind of very important, a very important part of how businesses should start thinking about this. This is not to be ignored as companies have to stay competitive.
Yeah, and this is going to go into the DNA of every aspect of every organization. There's no doubt about it. But companies are also in a bind that they have to recognize and figure out how to deal with, which is basically people don't have time to learn this. Who's got time to learn artificial intelligence? Who's got time to learn about how these models work? Most people are just keeping up with their jobs and trying to stay current and be an expert in the area they're already in, which means that, part of what's going to happen is they're going to have to create some specialized groups that can take a lead on this. It'd be like an internal consulting group that can help other parts of the organization learn fastest and take some of the burden of learning it off their hands so that they can, keep the organization moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's always a dilemma with the new technology. How much do you put into innovation? How much do you put into just getting the job done that you're doing now? That's always a challenge and the dilemma that I think a lot of companies are going to face. That's certainly true.
Well, and I think a really interesting point here, more from the perspective of an employee, is just wanting some rules of the road for how I am encouraged to use this technology. Is this something that my boss is going to look on fondly and say, kudos to you for experimenting and trying to help move us forward? Or would I get fired because there are security implications for putting this, this special data into a system that might not be set up for that? Or is it going to be considered plagiarism or cheating? So I think just from the level of the employee, figuring out how to motivate employees to use the technology the way you want them to, because they're going to feel the pressure to do something eventually. It seems likely to me.
Yeah, I think experiment. I think you're right. I mean, companies have to kind of come up with their policies around this. It's going to be a little bit of a waiting game for them to feel comfortable about that because it's so new. Experimentation, which is already going on, all over the place, makes a lot of sense. I mean, doing experimentation, but understanding what your company's policy is around that. I think in the end, ultimately, when you go to the issue of accountability, you're an employee in a job, and whatever tool you use, you kind of have to be accountable for the result. And I think there are questions that you raised about. I raised it also about, ownership, this notion of plagiarism, who really owns the output of these systems. I think that's still remains to be seen. That's a big economic question. But ultimately, I'm an employee and an employer, but, I'm going to hold people accountable for using the tool effectively within the guidelines and accountable for the result.
Yeah, just I would add to that. A lot of learning takes place informally. And I think a lot of experimentation should go on informally among people in an organization. And there it's really the leader's job to kind of cull together people's experiences, find out what seems to work, which doesn't work, so that you can begin to develop ideas in your own mind about where the guardrails are and what the policies need to be. Now, that doesn't mean people should be reckless and do first and ask for apologies later, but people need to be encouraged to play without many consequences at first, because that's what creativity and open-minded learning can come from, and that's ultimately what you want. And then I think that it's increasingly more serious about the sorts of things that you're looking for as an employee to guide your use of these technologies.
Yeah, you can't. I'll tell you, one big winner is cloud. Cloud is a winner because running these models is not cheap, and so everybody's racking up big compute bills to do this stuff. So that's a narrow but important implication of this technology economically.
Yeah, Jess, so I'd say in the lab I run, every day we sit down at lunch and we talk about how you use ChatGPT in a new way.
Yeah.
And it does lead to learning. So I'm trying to plan a vacation. You mentioned about planning a vacation. And someone in the lab was like, oh, I asked ChatGPT and it gave me a really good plan for 2 weeks. And I was like, oh my God, I hadn't thought about doing that. But then when I got into it, I realized that it started to tell me a lot of things with just a few different prompts, which led me to go back to the researcher in the lab and say, hey, did you realize that if you change your prompts a little bit, you're going to have a completely different answer? And they're like,
of course.
Do you see what I mean? And it's that kind of iteration where you've got to begin and put time into it and let the natural curiosity of people help guide you in the beginning.
Well, now that we're talking about travel, which puts most people in a good mood, I thought we could spend the last couple of minutes just kind of getting a little bit excited about this technology. I think we've spent a lot of time necessarily going through all the things to be cautious about, but what excites you about this technology? What leaves you optimistic about where this could take us?
I mean, for me, it's a new age. I mean, this is this is really the dawning of I've been in AI my entire life. I mean, my entire adult life, with this vision this driving vision that AI will ultimately complement human intelligence and amplify our ability, our creativity, our ability, enable us to realize the world that we want to create. That the bottleneck has so often been just how quickly can you compute, understand, create, permute, find solutions to our problems. And to the extent that this technology is going to help us do that, this is what people like myself and so many others have been working so hard to do. So you can start to see that it doesn't come without its challenge and its perils, as we talked about. But this is a new age, and I am ultimately optimistic for humanity. As I said, we have to learn, we have to understand, we have to be cautious. But I am wholly optimistic that there is no future of the human species without AI. It is the main accelerator. So anyway, I couldn't be more optimistic ultimately.
I'm also very optimistic, although I feel like I have more concerns than Dave does. And I would say for me, it's really about expanding human consciousness in a way that you can't do on your own. And if we can find the right way to partner with machines so that we all do better, I think that is a potential way to solve the real grand challenges we have that we can't solve now in climate,
Right.
in health, in other areas. And we've been stumped a long time on that.
Yeah, I should say, Brian, make a good point. I'll highlight as a last note here is, again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the technology underneath, like the ChatGPT, that ability to learn from sequences and define patterns. This is having a dramatic effect in drug discovery, for example, and in other areas, honestly, where things that took years can take months now. That's a big deal, right? So there is a fundamental learning technology underneath the ChatGPT that doesn't apply to just language, but applies to molecules and applies to drugs and so many other areas, as an example.
And I think if you take that and then you imagine just a little bit, if the next Mozart, the next Leonardo da Vinci, the next Marie Curie has these technologies, reaching for the stars is now possible.
Right.
And I guess that's where my head's at.
Yep.
Well, this is a lovely place to end it. We are at time. Thank you so much to both of you. I really appreciated you coming on and having this fascinating chat. Thank you to Brian Uzzi, Dave Ferrucci, and of course, our wonderful audience. Appreciate you and all the excellent questions. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks for putting this together. Thanks, Dave. See you soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.